So last week I did a video about my planting calendar for Salanova lettuce and baby greens for the lettuce mix. And this week I'm doing this video about everything else that I'm planting in my planting calendar. Temperatures during the daytime don't get to above 50 degrees until maybe the middle of April, and you won't get nighttime temperatures coming up above freezing until then either, reliably. And so that's something I have to think about as I'm, doing the planting calendar. And so just to kind of illustrate that, I'll start by talking about the sugar snap peas and the timing of how I'm going to do that this year based on last year's data. So the sugar snap peas, I thought, oh, I'm going to get them out as soon as I can. And so end of March, March 23rd, I direct seeded sugar snap peas into the main garden, and it took 25 days to germinate, just to germinate. So it doesn't really get you ahead to try and start earlier. I've done this in the past where I'm like, how early can I go? How early can I go? And I've had stuff out in the garden. It's pouring down rain and it's like so cold that the little plants are just like sitting there doing nothing, and I'm having to try and babysit them. And so, yeah, it doesn't make sense. So my second succession of peas I planted May 3rd, and it only took 11 days to germinate. Now, if you look from the days where, they actually germinated to when they were ready to harvest, the first succession took 83 days and the next one was 80 days. So actually about the same, earlier and later. And so, yeah, so that is just to illustrate how that works. You don't want to go too early. And so on my calendar, I've got, mid-April as being the time that I want to seed my carrots, like cover crop seeds, peas, anything that needs to be direct seeded. So it's reliably warm enough that they'll actually just germinate and grow. Yeah. Especially like with carrots that I want to be able to kind of keep ahead of any weeds that might try and grow. They need to germinate as quickly as possible and start growing. So that's what I'm looking at for those direct seeded crops in the main garden, is mid-April sometime to get those guys out there. Okay, so that's for the direct seeded stuff. Everything else now is transplants for the most part. And so looking at the calendar, back in March, I am going to seed my greens transplants at the same time I start my first Salanova lettuce. And so that includes like kale, collard greens, bok choy, chard, and parsley, things like that. And so whereas the lettuce takes a little bit longer kind of to get ready to transplant and to harvest, 5 weeks to transplant, 5 weeks to harvest early in the season, I've got the greens, 4 weeks to transplant and 4 weeks to harvest is when I looked at my data in my planting log. That's, they just seem to be a little bit faster than the lettuce. So we're going to go with that. And so greens transplant will be ready mid-April, or I can even plant them out if I, need a little bit more time at the beginning of May, and then they'll be ready to harvest at the beginning of June. So that is the plan with the greens. Okie dokie, so let's talk about leeks and green onion transplants. Leeks, I could probably start way earlier and get a harvest way earlier. But for now, I'm just going to do kind of what I've been doing, where I start the leeks late in March. So leeks, I started them end of March last year. And this year, I'm going to start them maybe a little bit earlier. And since I know that they would work pretty good to put them under lights for a while. They were ready to plant April 29th, which was about 30 days later, so about a month later. there are my leeks transplants going out mid-April when hopefully it's not freezing anymore at night. And maybe the daytime temperature is a little bit better. So there we go. We're putting out the leek transplants. And then last year, it was another 88 days before they were ready to harvest. Yeah, so that's almost like 3 months. And so then we've got a harvest happening in July. And in the past, I haven't been selling leeks, except for maybe at a community market or so, but it's mostly for us. Green onions are up next, and I've been getting them planted, you know, a little too late, and they're not quite ready when they need to be ready. So I took a close look at days to maturity and stuff for the green onions. This from, you know, my data from 2024 to see what I need to do this year. So hopefully I have it scheduled pretty good this time. So green onions, the first succession I planted April 3rd as seed in soil blocks, which has worked really good, and ready to transplant in just a couple of weeks, 16 days. And then it took about 55 days from transplant to harvest. The next one was seeded May 20th, took like 3 weeks to be ready to transplant. And then it was about 50 days from transplant to harvest. And then the third one, when I was seeding in July, it took, you know, a couple weeks to be ready to transplant, and then 60 days approximately they would have been harvested. Now I didn't harvest those green onions because it was just getting way too late in the season, and I wasn't selling anymore, and but kind of gave me an idea where they were ready to harvest. And so actually days to maturity are about the same, 71, 74, 75. So turning this over, taking a look at how much I was selling. You know, I was selling anywhere from like just 6 or 7 bunches to as many as 15 to 18 bunches. And then, you know, we use a couple bunches a week. And so I thought, well, you know, if I have 15 that are ready to harvest, that'll probably be enough. So each week's harvest would be 15 bunches of green onions. So in a tray, I do about 72. Sometimes I only get 60 out of those 72 soil blocks that are nice, good bunches of scallions. And so I'm going to say, like, okay, if I do 1 tray, that'll last me about 4 weeks, because usually the green onions hold pretty good. I mean, they start out maybe a little small, and then I'm selling them maybe a little big, you know, 4 weeks later, but I think it's kind of okay. So as I'm looking at when I want to harvest, first start harvesting my onions, I want to have 4 harvests from that 1/3 plot there all the way through August. So I'll harvest, and so then I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks that I would have to have them transplanted out. Okay, and so then when would I need to seed them? So I would need to go 1, 2, 3. So end of May, I would need to seed those green onions for that last succession. And so I kind of went with the same thing. So then if I need a harvest 4 weeks prior to this harvest here, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So my second planting of onions would have to start being harvested on July 10th. So then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks of harvest from that. And so then that means, okay, when do I need to transplant these, right? So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks, I figured I need to transplant out this second patch of green onions. Okay, so when do I need to seed them? It might take a little bit longer. 1, 2, 3 weeks prior to that, I need to seed those green onions. Okay, so then I'm going back again to 4 weeks prior to my second planting of onions. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. I need to be able to start harvesting my first patch of green onions. And so then that would mean I need to transplant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I did 8 weeks to transplant the first patch. So then I would need to seed them 1, 2, 3 weeks prior to that. That would be the first week of April, which makes sense because then I can get those transplanted mid-April when things have warmed up. So that is kind of how I figured my green onions. Last but not least, I was looking at my basil, which will go out into the greenhouses and get grown out there in the little greenhouses. And so I have to look at when can I safely get those where it's warm enough for them to start growing. So last year I started the basil in soil blocks April 22nd. It was 25 days until they were ready to transplant. Now, maybe it'll be 30 days, let's say about a month, right, to get the basil out there. But sometimes it's ready to go out earlier. So if I get basil earlier, that would be great. Well, they were transplanted on May 22nd and then harvested July 12th, which is another 21 days. So it only took about like 3 weeks to be able to go ahead and harvest. But maybe what if it takes a little bit longer? Let's just look at it as a month. So that's kind of how I did things. I just looked at when can I safely plant out my basil. And so they will go under lights in the house until they're ready to transplant out and it's warm enough in the greenhouses. I went just a little bit earlier and said, okay, let's seed the soil blocks on April 16th, mid-April, and then kind of assuming that maybe 3 weeks they'd be ready to transplant. 1, 2, 3. So beginning of May. So when you look at the temperatures in May, it's like, okay, it's pretty well above the 50s, you know, hitting a few high 40s. And then, you know, the greenhouses are, depending on the sunlight, you know, are anywhere from 70s to 50s and 60s. And nighttime temperatures, you're not hitting any freezing temperatures anymore. You know, you're getting a lot of mid 40s and stuff like that all through May. So we're planting the basil out at the beginning of May. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and we're kind of assuming it'll be about 4 weeks before they're nice and mature to harvest and not have to skimp, right? So that's the beginning of June. So we'll see if I can get that. Basil I didn't harvest until mid-July last year, but that's part of it is I didn't get it transplanted out, you know, right on time and stuff like that. And I got it seeded a little bit later. Yeah, I was a little bit late with the basil last year. Okay, so that is the planting calendar done for the 2025 season. And so I'll just kind of collect some data and see if I can't get it dialed in even better for the 2026 season.